It turns out that genetic ghosts are people that are your genealogical ancestors. They really are your ancestors in every sense you could imagine it, except they don't give you any DNA. And we engaged with this, and we found out that there's some really surprising things that really across the board people haven't fully appreciated. It's really well-established science, but it's really overlooked. One of them is really cool, I want to share with you today. The basic idea is it turns out that some of our genealogical ancestors are not genetic ancestors. There's a difference between genetics and genealogy. One of the best ways I've found to explain it is by a graph like this. You can see yourself right here, you're a person, I think. And you can see the next shell outside. That is your parents, your mom and your dad. Then this is your maternal grandparents. So mom's mom, mom's dad, dad's mom, dad's dad. You got it?
Yep.
So you can see it going out 10 generations. You can see that every single generation, the number of ancestors doubles, right? Now they're all shaded. What's going on is we're shading them from gray to white based on how much of your genome you might have randomly inherited from one of them. Now, if I redid this and rejiggered it, it would look slightly different, but the general shape would be the same. There's a little bit of a cast of a die involved in this. But I'm simulating basically how this person's genome is apportioned to them from everyone else. You can see that it makes sense. You know, if you look at your genetics of your parents, you get 50% of your genes from them. Even though they're your 100% your genealogical ancestors. Look at your grandparents, you get 25% of your genes from them. Even though you're 100% their genealogical descendants. Now, the part that's very non-intuitive is this green that's here. The green are called genetic ghosts. Isn't that a cool name? It turns out that genetic ghosts are people that are your genealogical ancestors. They really are your ancestors in every sense you could imagine it, except they don't give you any DNA. They're your ancestors, but they don't give you any DNA. That was really surprising, first of all, to me. And it turns out that happens in just a few hundred years. So this is just about 300 years back. And some of my ancestors are giving me no DNA. If I go back 1,000 years ago, if I go back 2,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, it turns out that the vast majority of my ancestors give me no DNA. It turns out that it's kind of like becoming a genetic ancestor is a little bit like winning the lottery. I maybe have 2,000 years ago, maybe 50 million ancestors, but maybe only a couple thousand actually give me any DNA. And the ones that actually do give me DNA, they're the ones that kind of won across that. So by all intents and purposes, to first approximation, and this is a crazy thought, the majority of my ancestors don't give me any DNA. All right, so that was one crazy thing we found out. That turns out to be important. Because if we now play that simulation forward, if you imagine if there was Adam and Eve created in a divinely created garden, and then they started having kids, and kids after them, kids after them, and on this diagram, every now and then, they're going to breed with people outside their lineage, which is what the story was, and that'll dilute things. It turns out that pretty quickly, it turns out that you'd expect that they don't leave any DNA. That's a crazy thought. That means that Adam and Eve, if they existed, if we just go into that thought experiment, they don't pass us any DNA. They certainly don't pass us any DNA that we recognize as theirs. And so that means that there's actually no evidence one way or the other about whether or not they exist, and whether or not, even that they were de novo and suddenly created. What we do know is that they interbred with everyone outside the garden. Of course, that does raise a lot of theological questions, and that's actually part of the fun of the conversation for me.